question because I hadn't pushed start on the recording. So if you're listening to the recording, then you're a question behind, but we'll cover it again just for the recording's sake. All right, what group wants to talk about this one? So you guys already went, so I'm gonna wait to call on you guys. Somebody else. Somebody. Don't worry. It's okay if you don't have it all correct. We're gonna talk about it. So I'm gonna say group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So 5 went. I'm gonna roll a dice. And except for 5, if your number comes up, then it's you. Group 3, which I think is you guys, right? Okay, oh, I heard some of it, yeah. So
pretty much the only thing that we decided about this was that he's bending over to pick something up, and there's obviously force applied to his back.
Mm-hmm.
His elbows. I don't know how to say it. Like,
That's why we're doing this. You're good. Good. So, I threw a little bit of a curveball at you guys because before we only had a single joint, and we did have 2 weights, the weight of the forearm and hand plus the load. So here we have a little bit more, but you guys are right. You're on the right track. So if we, now I had the knees bent a little bit. I mean, maybe they're slightly bent, but if you were, I guess I'm giving a little bit of the context here. Let's say you are doing what's called a stoop lift. You're just, instead of a squat lift, you're stooping over to pick something up. All of these forces and torques are coming back on your back. And so they all add up. And if you think about it, and I don't even remember what muscles insert down just beyond your hips, from your back. But you have these muscles here that, if you think about it like with your bicep, the leverage that your bicep has isn't great. I mean, in terms of physics, it's inserted down here. If you think about, if you try to open a door and you're pushing right next to the hinge, that's what your bicep is doing, basically, except, it's pulling. But if you are trying to open a door right by the hinge, in terms of physics, you don't have very good leverage. The bicep doesn't have really good leverage. Now, there are some muscles in our body that have better leverage. One easy one is the jaw. So you have muscles that come down here, and instead of inserting, I mean, it does insert way back here by the hinge, by the joint, but it also inserts down here. And if you think of some animals, they have a lot more jaw strength than we do, And part of that is because they have more leverage, just because of the physics of where it inserts. So if you could imagine, not that this is possible, but if your bicep inserted further up your forearm, you have a lot more leverage. You could lift more. Anyway, the point though is that your muscles don't have tons of leverage. Now, there's a lot of muscles that are being used here, not just a couple, but the ones that are being used, you know, they're inserted in certain places along your hips, to bring, you know, to straighten that joint out. And there's a lot of torque being applied there. All of this would add up to the torques at your back. So what I want you to do is just to be able to talk about this. So for example, A would be the force here is the weight of, and we didn't really get into tons of detail on the anthropometry, measuring body parts. But this would be the weight from your hip or your lower back to the top of your head. So again, imagine someone whose job it was to weigh body parts and figure out where the center of mass was with just the torso and the head. And that is here at A. And so the force is the weight of those two body segments. So of your torso and your head. And the torque is how much torque this muscle has to apply to counteract that weight. So there's torque being applied down here to counteract this body segment, just the mass of it, the weight of it. At B, it's for your arm, your whole arm and hand. So just this body segment. B represents the weight of your upper, lower arm and hand. So, the force of that is the weight, basically, of that body segment. And the torque is the additional torque you have to apply at your back well, I mean, if we're talking about just holding it static, then just to keep yourself even, not going up or down. And then finally, C is for the load. So, so this is the force or the weight of the load due to gravity, and then the torque that has to be applied at your back to counteract that. Now, these numbers aren't, I mean, I just made up the numbers on the test. They're also just made up. One thing I want to point out, I made this lower, but if you think about torques, what happens as you move away from your fulcrum goes up. And if you think of the equation, it kind of makes sense. So we have the force times the radius times, the sine of the angle. All things being equal, if the angle is the same, if the radius goes way up, even if our load is less. So hopefully you're lifting a box that's not as heavy as your torso and head. But because the radius goes up so much, the torque here would actually, a lot of times, if you're lifting way out here, the torques are much higher for your load, even though it's a little box. The torques due to the load much higher than for your torso and head. So if you understand those concepts, then you should be fine. Maybe just practice communicating those in a clear way. And well, any questions on that? I keep my dice handy. Yeah.
Are the numbers for the
Die.
torques like what's added? Or like are they all added up, or is this like?
Well, so this torque is specific to the arm and hand. It's specific to that one. So if you were to add it up, I mean, wasn't necessarily expecting you to do this, but I guess you could just do some simple addition. You don't have to do anything crazier than that. But if you were to add this up, then you could say this is how much torque is being applied to the back, to the joint and the muscles, and just holding this lift. Other questions? Okay, good. I'm glad I remembered to start the video. Okay. How are the terms human factors and ergonomics related? Take like 1 minute to talk about that. And then whoever's number comes up, unless we have a volunteer, you'll be it, except for group 5 and 3. All right, maybe a minute is too long. I mean, this one is pretty straightforward. Or is it not? Do you need more time? Okay, all right. There's some of you I can tell are prepared, and that's good. Real quick, for the purposes of the recording, I'm going to throw in number 2. So be sure to be able to mention a few historical events that changed and influenced human factors and ergonomics. The Shirtwaist Triangle Fire, World War II, and others. And just in general, how they changed human factors and ergonomics. 3 to 5 sentences. Okay, so who wants to go who's not group 3 or 5? Okay. Huh? Okay, good. So technically, officially, they are synonymous. They are the same thing. In practice, though, what tends to happen with them? Huh? Yes, they do. So one tends to refer to the physical world, and the other tends to refer to the cognitive side. Which is which? You got to. Good. Okay, you're right. Yeah. So, I mean, so it is correct that human factors and ergonomics are the same thing. Generally, in practice, though, ergonomics tends to refer to the physical world. So lifting, how comfortable the chair is when you sit in it, the pace that you work at, that would be work physiology. And we talked about biomechanics. So the biomechanics of lifting, for example, that's all tends to be referred to as ergonomics. And human factors tends to refer to the cognitive side of things, which we are going to get into more later in the class, in the semester. But if you think of memory, of your sensory inputs to your brain, your ability to see things, interpret it, make a decision and act on it, all that is human factors. So yeah, so just be able to describe that in a basic way. 3 to 5 sentences, that might be a 3-sentence one. It doesn't have to be super long, just as long as it gets the point across and it's clear that you understand. And I think it is important to understand the practical definition, just because when you get out in industry, when people talk about things, they'll probably refer to them in that way. Are there any questions? Cool. What is the objective of human factors and ergonomics? So take 30 seconds. Let's talk about this one. All right. Is there a group that's not 2, 3, or okay, no one wants to go?
So the objective is study behavior to find the best way to design products and systems maximum.
Good. Good. And I would, so one comment that I'm going to add is that there's sort of 2 trains of thought with human factors and ergonomics. One focuses on changing the worker to fit the job, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then the other has a focus on changing the job or the workplace design to fit the worker. Of the 2, I feel like the latter is much more important. Changing the environment, changing the workplace, changing the design of the equipment to fit workers is more important, and generally is where you should focus. Now, it doesn't mean that the other side doesn't have value as well. And so think of training. Sometimes it's not possible to modify the workplace or the design of something. And so you will need to train. You will need to have protocols and other things in place to make sure that people can do their job. So one area of interest for me is wildland firefighter safety and health. It's hard to modify their workplace. They're hiking over mountains and through forest canyon. You can't really change that, and you can't change the fact that there's a fire. They're breathing in a bunch of smoke and other gases. You can't really change that. And you could use other examples in other industries. Certain things we just can't change, and that's where you do have to focus on not just human factors, but changing people and the way they do their job to be more efficient, more safe. Good. I think I said to skip question 5. It is helpful to know the system design process and the different phases, but I don't feel like it's a real strong focus for us. So discuss the following graphic. So we had mentioned it briefly. Take 30 seconds to talk about it, and then we'll discuss. All right. First of all, what piece of equipment was it trying to show? Does anyone remember? A wood lathe. Good. So I think it's just groups 4 and 6 that haven't gone. So of groups 4 and 6, who wants to go? Okay, good. Right. So this one is just showing, a normal human at a lathe and where all the controls are. And if you wanted to change a person to fit this equipment, this is what they'd have to look like. You can see shoulders are wider. I guess the arms aren't longer. I would think of maybe Go-Go Gadget arms or something. But anyway, but you're right. So this one is how you would design a human to fit a wood lathe. And obviously we can't, in terms of ergonomics and the physical world, we can't redesign humans. it's not really an option. I think that's one reason ergonomics, going back to the last question, ergonomics tends to focus almost entirely on changing the workplace. You can do training and you can have work practices that enhance productivity and safety, but but then you're relying on people, and people are not as reliable as, say, modifying the equipment. If you modify the equipment, it's going to stay that way and it's not going to change.
So for that, you would just say that ergonomics relative to
Yes. So in that case, in the case of a wood lathe, I mean, you can train and have, you know, SOPs, standard operating procedures for using that equipment, but that's not very effective, especially because, well, I'm thinking of OSHA specifically. OSHA really likes the idea of education and training, and it's important. I don't want to bag on training and education too much, but it relies solely on humans. If that's your only focus, you're relying on humans to first learn and understand the training, and then to actually do it and follow procedure. And a lot of times it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And if you think of a workplace, any industry, you're going to have some turnover. You might have someone who's really well trained to use a piece of equipment, operate something, and then they're going to get another job. And you've got to retrain and re-educate all over again and hope that the next person can be just as reliable as the one you had. So it generally, if you can design the system around the worker, then it's more effective. It will be more reliable. So talk about 3 different data classification schemes and describe them. Take about a minute maybe for this one. All right, so I think this is group 4. Yeah, so what do you think?
I'm not sure if this is right, but is it the input?
So this one is referring to types of data, ways to classify data. Yeah.
I was confused because I found where, is it where you talk about nominal ordinal?
Mhm.
But there's 4 of them.
Yeah, so just be able to describe 3 different classes or categories of data types.
So if we were to describe like discrete and continuous and then both, or is it just 3 of those 4?
3, well, so I was just, the way that Dr. Fogelman breaks it out is a little bit different than the way I actually, you know what? So his question is a little bit, to me, it's also a little bit unclear. But now I think I understand his question. There are 3 different ways to classify data. So if you look at the research slides, that lecture, slides 10, 11, and 12, each of those slides is a different way of classifying data. And to be honest, when I classify data, I think of all of those, but just in different ways than he has them.
Yeah, because even in the video, you said that it can be, you're like, I don't like this definition for discrete data, because you said that it can be both qualitative and quantitative, and then
So let's talk about it. You know what? Let's go to those real quick. What? Well, so consider each of these slides a different sort of scheme for classifying data. So you will want to be able to just talk about each of the different types with the types of data inside each one. So this is, consider this scheme number 1, and it breaks it out by qualitative versus quantitative,
so
and just that. And then the second slide breaks it out by discrete and continuous. I tend to think of it as a little bit more of a hierarchy that has all of this included. And if it helps, I can talk about that as well.
well, I just don't know. So you want us to explain qualitative and quantitative, and then like together, and then explain discrete and continuous together, and then explain them?
Yes.
Or
So
really
that's what he's asking for. As long as you're able to talk about what each of these means, then you'll be good.
What's the 5 of them?
Sorry?
It's like the 5 different.
Oops.
You basically want to split up into the grade.
Yeah. Be able to
You want us to like
contrast. You could. Yeah. Well, yeah. One thing I'll say is I'm human, and the easier you make it for me to find your answer and know what you're talking about, the easier it is for me to grade. And that means the happier I am. And if I'm happy, then subconsciously I might give you a higher number than you know, even if the words were all the same, you just had it laid out to where like I could see everything clearly. And so if you want to have little subheadings and like bullet points, that helps. Now, one quick thing about, you know, this is a kind of a human factors thing, but if you have, so bullet points help to draw your attention to something. But if you had all bullet points, it sort of defeats the purpose of bullet points, right? So having a kind of a variety and a mixture of formats as you write, whether it's handwriting or typing, helps direct your reader's attention to stuff in different ways. So if you have a big, huge paragraph of text, the reader looks at that and thinks, I don't want to read all that, you know, maybe that's what they think. But if you have, you know, a little bit of paragraph and then a few bullet points underneath that, If you're like me, you think, okay, that's a short paragraph. I can get through that pretty quick, and then look at the bullet points, boom, 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 and just think about stuff like that with any communication you have, and your reader will thank you for it, and is more likely to read it. Calissa, you had a question. Sorry. Okay.
So like one, the three would be distributed, continuous, qualitative, quantitative, and then the four nominal, ordinal.
Yes. So those would be the three schemes of classifying data. Now, so the way I learned these, they're part of a hierarchy, and ordinal, so like nominal is definitely qualitative. It's a qualitative data type because it's just names, gender, blood type, ethnic group. Those, there's not a number associated with any of those. There is no natural order to them. So that's qualitative in my mind. Ordinal, it could be, you could think of it as a qualitative data type generally. So your grade, there might be a number associated with your grade, but if you think of the letter grades, it's not a number, but there is an order, low, medium, high, or Likert scale. It's a type of qualitative data. So the key is just that you're able to describe all these types. So altogether, there's 8. What I would suggest is for these, for example, if you're not wanting to write big, long sentences, you could include these both in the same sentence. So qualitative refers to categories, whereas quantitative is a numerical value. And just be able to describe them briefly for me, what types they are.
Nominal, ordinal, simple, and racial, or ratios you want us to categorize as qualitative? We just lay out what.
You don't need to. Just be able to define in a basic sense what it is. And if you want to give examples to help clarify, then that's good too. If you don't have to give examples, but if you tried to define it, in a sense with words, and just you feel like it didn't come out very clear, then give an example, so that if I'm reading it and I'm wondering, do they really know what they're talking about, and then you give an example that makes sense, and I say, okay, you do know what you're talking about, you just probably weren't able to kind of express it in the way you wanted to. So if you ever feel like you can use an example to show that you know what it is, it just might not be coming out in words, feel free to do that. Okay. So don't worry about, don't worry about the classification schemes. Just be able to talk about the different data types. All right, from the same lecture, the different research types. So we're gonna go back to the die for this one. So I feel like this is a good one for us to just cover. I want to make sure that we get through everything and on time. So we will go briefly through this, unless someone wants to talk about it. Descriptive statistics is, I won't say maybe the most basic type of statistics, but it's one of the most basic types. And what you're really doing here is just trying to understand and describe what is there, the current state. So if you, let's think of like the age of everyone in this classroom. If we listed out, we could get the data. So we gather everyone's ages, and then we would use descriptive statistics to figure out, to better understand the distribution of ages. So, you know, most of you are probably fairly young. Is anyone younger than 20? Okay, 19? Okay, so we'll go 19, and I have a, well, is anyone older than 35? That's me. It's okay if you are, because you'll make me feel not so old. But anyway, it's okay. It's okay being old. So this would be the range of ages in this room. And we'd want to, if we want to better understand, we could look at, we could look at the average, we could look at a distribution, and I would have a feeling that it would kind of look like this, and I'd be the little blip over here. Anyway, we can look at different measures, different statistics to understand the ages in the room. And that would be descriptive. Inferential, we make inferences about a population usually based on a sample. It's rare that you're able to sample an entire population unless you've defined the population very narrowly, like this classroom, this is our population. But you could define us as a sample of, say, the Embry-Riddle student body on the Prescott campus. You could define the population different ways, but generally you don't have all the data. You have some, and so you have to make inferences about your sample and extend them to the population. And that gets into this third one is, I never realized that guns were so important in Yavapai County until I moved here. I like shooting. I just don't go shooting or go outdoors enough. But if we wanted to understand, say, the proportion of gunsmiths in Yavapai County to non-gunsmiths, we probably wouldn't be able to get a survey to every single person in Yavapai County saying, are you a gunsmith or not? That would be difficult. But we could get a survey to maybe 100 or maybe 1,000 people, not the 100, I don't know, 150. Well, if it includes Cottonwood, then it's probably, I don't know, it's multiple 100,000s of people. We're not going to get all that, but maybe we could get 100 or 1,000. And from that sample, the small sample, we could use some of these, statistics to get a sense for how many gun owners there are to non-gun owners or gunsmiths in Yavapai County. So the sample is a subset of the population. And then the parameter versus statistic, the parameter would be gunsmithing. Are you or are you not? And the statistic would be the actual number that tells us, so the proportion of gun owners, gunsmiths to non-gunsmiths. Observational data is where we don't interact with or manipulate the population or whatever being studied. We don't change anything. We're just observing. We're a fly on the wall, taking notes basically. With experimental, think of studies on rats, or with humans, think of clinical trials, like a new cancer drug being tested. So there are cases where we do test on humans because we have to. We want to before we send the drug to the masses. So clinical trials or experimental tests on rats, those would be examples of that. With evaluative, well, I mean, you can look through this. If you don't have to write all that. If you just have a basic sense of what that means, then that's good enough. So this, we'll do this next question quickly as well. From the study guide, it's reliability versus validity. Okay, I don't want too purple. Let's try blue and purple. This is the way I think of reliability and validity. And if you want to describe it in the same way on the test, that's fine with me. Actually, I won't put well, I was a Boy Scoutmaster for a while, and it's interesting. So when they're doing their rifling merit badge, it doesn't matter if whether they are in the bullseye or not, as long as they have a grouping, a cluster of shots, then it's good. And part of the reason for that is their gun sights may be off, and so it's not really their fault that they keep missing the bullseye. If the sights are not set up right. Anyway, so they just have to be able to produce this. That's bad if you're trying to get the merit badge. So let's just do this together. So these, well, it's right there. Which one of these would represent reliability and which one would represent validity? Good. So I guess I'll just talk about that. What that means is, so here on average, it's a fairly good approximation of what you're after, right? Let's say you have a screening, I'm thinking of medical, say you have a diagnostic test for cancer, and you don't necessarily want this for a diagnostic tool, but if it's a valid test, that means that on the average, when you do the test, it's centered around what you're after to be able to make a diagnosis. Let's say you have this for your test. So you really don't want this. You don't want that either. But here, it's, let's say you have people who, well, maybe this one. Example. Reliability means that you're able to produce the same results consistently, whether it's in the target or not. Obviously, you want, well, if you're like, I don't know, Robin Hood or some crazy accurate person, then that's what your target would look like. So this would be reliability and validity. The validity part is it an accurate measure for what you're looking for? So here's a health-related one that I think makes more sense. Let's say you want to do a study on how healthy Embry-Riddle students are, and we choose to use BMI as our measure for healthiness. Is BMI a valid measure for healthiness? Why not? So you're right, it's not. Why is BMI not necessarily great at saying how healthy you are? I mean, for me, my BMI is probably accurate. They would say you're overweight. You need to lose weight. But that's not always the case. So for some people, they'll be in excellent physical condition, but their BMI says they're obese. What's going on there? Okay, good. So it does not consider your body composition. And so now generally we do use BMI as a sort of indicator of health, but it's not necessarily, it does have some validity or some accuracy issues. It's not necessarily a valid measure of health. If you want something valid, you might have to look at more things than just, one measure. So let's do this one together. What happens if human factors and ergonomics is not included in the design phase of a project? I'll roll. And I know I didn't give you time to prepare, so just your best shot. Group 6. That's you guys. What happens if you don't consider human factors and ergonomics until everything's designed and it's too late? Good. So while the aircraft is in AutoCAD, changing the seat or changing things is a few clicks of a button, and it might affect costs a little bit down the road, but you just tweak some things while it's in AutoCAD. After the aircraft has been manufactured, well, it gets a bit more expensive and a bit more difficult to change anything. So just be able to describe that. And if you want to use a scenario, that would be helpful as well, to show that you want to be involved in the design cycle, the design phase. So we did not talk a lot about cost-benefit analysis. We looked at one, but I didn't really explain what was going on. Basically what you're doing, so if you look at there was an example with, what was it? I think it was a carpal tunnel syndrome example. It's one that Dr. Fogelman did as a consultant with I think it was like oil and gas company in Texas. Anyway, but I'm just not remembering. Basically what you're doing is you look at the costs of your intervention. And in their case, maybe it was getting, you could use a different example, sit-stand workstations. So maybe you have a bunch of people who are getting hurt backs or kinks in their neck, and tendonitis and carpal tunnel syndrome, and they all work in the office, and you're like, how, all you do is work at your computer. Well, sitting at a computer for long periods of time isn't good. And so a cost-benefit analysis would basically be just to look at the cost of your interventions. And if you look at Dr. Fogelman's example, it was broken down by years. I think his went horizontally. I'm going down, but you look at the costs per year, and the initial costs of the intervention are pretty high. Let's say it costs $20,000 to buy all the sit-stand workstations and nice monitors and whatever. Spare no expense, right? Really nice workstations. And then you might have some continuing costs, but they're not really that much. On the benefit side, you look at the money that you will save. And you would look at it by year, the same years, but this could be workers' compensation. It could be productivity. People are going to be more productive if you give them better workstations. Wow. Interesting. You're going to have less absenteeism, better morale. It's hard for some of these, it's hard to put a dollar value to, but they are there. Along with this, insurance premiums, a bunch of things that, again, you don't necessarily think about, and then you would look at the value of those over time. And a lot of times with ergonomics, especially, not always can you say it of all interventions, but this number is going to be higher, or this number is going to be higher, your benefit, than the cost. Just be able to describe that. And again, if you want to use an example, that's fine. So the task analysis, there are different types of task analysis, but think of the job hazard analysis that we did. Some of you guys did making toast, right? You guys did making a sandwich. Yeah. Anyway, so think of that and be able to talk about that. Two general types of task analysis. Do you guys have any thoughts? Yeah. So the hierarchy of controls is important. I don't think that's what he's getting at here. Well, keep. What else do you have? Okay, I thought you were talking about the hierarchy of controls. Yes. So you're right. Do you want to tell us a little bit more, just a little bit about each one of them?
So the hierarchical task analysis, HTA, is a way to break down a complex task to individual. And it's like that example where you have to prepare and print a document, so you have to open Word, create text.
Yeah, he has looks kind of like this. He has all these bubbles up here of the tasks, and then like the small tasks underneath. I mean, it doesn't look exactly like that, but something like that. Sorry, and keep going.
And then the second one was the job safety hazard analysis. It implies evaluation and iteration, but uses steps like procedure analysis. So that's like when our group did like filling up your car with gas, and I have to job and do that to identify hazard. Determine necessary control of hazard.
Good. Thank you. So we're going to move quick on these last ones. So I'll just talk about them. But you're right. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about the shirtwaist triangle fire, and it spurred a lot of changes with fire codes, but also occupational safety and health. And you don't have to go into detail necessarily, just be able to talk a little bit about the actual event and basically what I just said about some of the outcomes. Don't worry about number 15. So the hierarchy of controls for number 16, ways of. Remind me of the other four. So I consider some of those part of administrative controls. You know, for me, for me, there's 5, but 2 of them are really mostly for the design phase. Engineering, administrative, and personal. But do be able to talk about the ones that he specifically mentions. So worksite analysis, training, education. I consider those part of administrative, but be able to talk about those. You know, just a few briefly. Types of connective tissue. So connective means it's soft, right? So what were those? Everything except bone. So on his list, everything except bone. Tendons, ligaments are the big ones. Muscle. I guess, I mean, it is technically connective, but so be able to describe those. Don't worry about 18 and 19. And any questions? So I'll have the exams printed, and I'll probably have a couple pages printed and stapled together for you with like just a spot for your name and stuff on top. So you'll write on that instead of like a blue book. And yeah, as soon as you're done on Thursday, you can go.
What were the methods for managing risk factors?
So he talks about engineering controls and then some administrative controls. I consider them administrative. Things like worksite analysis, like a task analysis would be a type of control as well. Training. I can't remember which slides those are from. Let's look at them real quick. Probably here, but oh yeah, engineering, administrative. So these are starting at slide 21 on the 4th set of slides.
Is it HFE and safety slides?
Yes, HFE and safety slides, starting on slide 21, engineering controls, administrative controls, training, which I consider part of administrative, worksite analysis. I also consider that part of administrative. But be able to just describe them generally. So, you know, 1, maybe 2 sentences on each one. That's all you would need. So try to be able to kind of synthesize all that, not all of it, but the main ideas from those into just a brief response. All right, thanks guys.